For those of you that I haven't met before, I see a lot of new faces here. My name is Colleen Fitzpatrick, and I'm the Executive Director at the Rotary Center for the Arts. So welcome to everyone tonight. Very happy to see you online, if I haven't seen you here at the Rotary Center. And for those of you that might not know who the Rotary Center is, we are a performing and visual arts center here in Kelowna for the last 18 years, and we're located in downtown Kelowna in the Cultural District. And we strive to improve the economic, culture, and social quality of life here in our community by fostering participation in the arts. So this is our first art talk, and I'm really pleased to see so many people online, really excited about that. This is part of the RCA's At Home program that we started back in April in response to COVID. So we have a virtual cinema house, and we're releasing new films every Friday, documentary films. We have a social club, and we have educational workshops, and now we've added once a month these art talks. I'm really, really happy to have Michael V. Smith here as one of our speakers. And the art talks are an opportunity for artists and art leaders in our community to have a conversation with each other. And thank you to Michael for his talk tonight. He is going to be talking about writing from silence. I'm really intrigued by this topic. It examines taboo stereotypes, family history, and cultural silences to reveal how writing can function as a means of speaking truth to power. So just a little bit of housekeeping notes. Michael will speak to us for 40 minutes, and feel free to use the chat to ask questions. We'll have a 20-minute Q&A following the talk. So I will pose your questions to Michael. So we'll be online for an hour, wrapping up at 8 o'clock. Just a little bit about our speaker tonight. During the day, you'll find Associate Professor Michael V. Smith walking the hallways at UBCO in the Faculty of Creative and Critical Studies. Michael V. Smith is an interdisciplinary artist working as a writer, a filmmaker, and a performance artist. He's very busy. His most recent book is called Bad Ideas, and it was published by Nightwood Editions in 2017. And as a writer, Associate Professor Michael V. Smith works with small town stories, examining issues of class, identity, community, and belonging. And his novel Cumberland was nominated for the Amazon Books in Canada First Novel Award, and his first book of poetry called What You Can't Have was nominated for the Rillet Prize. And My Body Is Yours, Smith's memoir of growing up queer and femme, was shortlisted for a Lambda Literary Award. All told, I counted 24 grants, awards, and distinctions, too long to all mention here for our speaker tonight. So we're very pleased to have him with us for this conversation. So with that, I'd like to turn over the conversation to Michael.
Super. Thanks, Colleen. Bios are always so embarrassing, but thanks for all those sweet things. So I want to thank Colleen and Karmalakoff and everyone at the RCA for inviting me to give this art talk. I'm super flattered. It's a privilege to be able to speak about my work, and a joy just to have people to share these ideas with. It's a joy sharing anything with people in these strange days. And if you know me, talking is one of my great loves. So I'm glad to be here. And I also want to thank the Okanagan Nation for their continued guardianship of their unceded territory. I'm a guest on this land where I live and work, and where I'm coming to you today. And I love this place. My talk about silence today is an invitation to hear the voices we have marginalized. And I think of the Okanagan peoples and how much I have learned from moments when I've been invited to listen. So thank you. And I want to give just a small heads up that there may be triggers in this talk. There is reference to childhood sexual play and bullying. And for racialized folk, there's a reference to the use of the N-word. I don't use the word. And I think I move gently through those stories, but it's worth just mentioning. I'm framing my talk today around a principle that I call writing from silence. It goes by a bunch of different names, like speaking truth to power maybe, or writing back, or writing against cultural forces. And just to do a little bit of business before I get into the meat of it, Colleen, I think the camera is trapped on you. So we're watching you while I give the talk. It's just a little bit of weird Zoom
That is
visit.
not what I see. Okay, just love all this technology. I do have someone working in the background for me on the
Well,
tech.
it might just be my screen, which is funny. Oh, Andrea says she sees me in the speaker view, no problem. So something's just gone funny in my camera. That's my fault. Okay, that's fine. I don't care who I look at. I'm not looking at myself. My
Okay,
husband
I
sees
can
me
do something
too.
in the back end on that.
Yeah, no, it's probably my Zoom. Okay, there we go. So that's all my preamble to the beginning of the talk. Writing from silence really it's a strategy or a tool that has consistently been with me through my creative career. It's a productive idea, it's nodal or rhizomatic, which means it's revealed itself to me in many forms and places. And it's helped me to think about what writing is, how it works, what purpose it might serve, what purpose art and writing might serve. And I'm hoping that by unpacking this idea of how and where writing from silence has manifested for me in my own work and in my life, it might open some doors and create some new or clearer framing for the audience, you too, in your own practice of being a human who makes things or being a human who consumes things that are made. So today I'm sharing stories about silence and writing and giving voice to both. When I was a young reader, before I knew I wanted to be a writer, before I even knew that I was gay, when I was reading for the pure pleasure of it, because words on paper made my small, complicated tween life make more sense. The world made more sense when I was reading. I made more sense. When books were first explaining me to myself, I read a young adult novel called Then Again, Maybe I Won't, Judy Bloom. I was 10 or 11. Her narrator, Tony, was a 12-year-old. I had to look those details up because I only remember two things about the story. One evening, Tony accidentally spies his teenage neighbor taking off her shirt through their bedroom windows. He sees this. And Tony, in his generous wisdom, talks about having nocturnal emissions. I had had nocturnal emissions, but I'd no idea what they were. I never talked about them with anyone. I'd never heard that expression before. I didn't know this thing that happened in my body had words for it. It was a common experience. And that book, I think, was my first very clear example of writing from silence. Judy Bloom has been in a lot of hot water over the decades for writing about childhood experiences that most people aren't willing to discuss. Judy's books give voice to uncomfortable things that adults have failed to discuss with children. Her books articulate life moments that others refuse to acknowledge. Throughout my young life, books were friends, they were company, they were my teachers and my parents, modeling behavior, offering insights, demonstrating alternatives. They explored big themes and big ideas, which made me feel more alive, more real, more seen than in my everyday world. Anne of Green Gables, for example, showed me that I wasn't the only kid who struggled with a feeling of being fundamentally alone, who couldn't help but fail at life, but who eventually found love. Anne Shirley convinced me, a lonely, sometimes suicidal kid, that I too could be well loved. That said, there were no gay kids in the Judy Bloom books I read as a preteen. There is Artie, who was a supporting character in her 1975 novel Forever, but he was secondary, and that storyline was just about his sexual life. He didn't really have a life, and I didn't read Forever as a kid. There were no gay kids in Green Gables. There were no gay hobbits, no gay Hardy Boys, unfortunately, no gay chrysalids, no gays in the stories I read by Alice Munro or Mavis Gallant, when I first came to adult can lit. No gays in any poetry or plays or stories I ever read in my entire young life. I was an adult before I read a book with a gay person in it, a person a little bit like me. In this day and age, that's kind of gobsmacking because there's lots of queer literature for kids. But 30 years ago, there wasn't much of the gay in can lit, and it was really hard to find in Cornwall, Ontario. So when I did start writing my own stories as a teenager and into my young adult life, I wanted to put the gay into those worlds that I knew. For a very, very long time, I wanted to be the gay Alice Munro. I wanted to see my own life, a queer one, a small town one, represented in can lit. So I could make books that were good, queer company, and maybe help out someone else like Anne Shirley and Judy Bloom had helped me. My desire to manifest the gay is a kind of extension of Judy Bloom. Writing from silence means, for me, not just articulating what hasn't been said, but manifesting on the page who hasn't been heard or seen in our literature, who hasn't been felt, whose shoes we haven't walked in. Writing from silence is a commitment to noticing who is being ignored or omitted or deleted from our stories. What are the lives that aren't being recorded? Maybe you've done this already. Lots of marginalized people know this experience. If you haven't thought about it before, though, a good place to start is to simply ask, what books did you read as a child? Who was in those books? And who wasn't? Or if we want to probe more deeply, you can ask, who were the heroes and the antagonists in the books you read? Who were the secondary characters? Who was in the background? Who wasn't there at all? I sometimes, when I give this presentation or a presentation like this to students in my undergrad classes, I sometimes get kids who say, yeah, but I'm not a gay guy. I'm a straight white dude. How do I find silences when so much can lit is already about straight white dudes? They don't actually say that, but they say something like that. We find stories, I think, by listening. We pay attention to which people in our lives have not been written about yet. What lifestyles do you know that aren't in fiction? The circuit party, like the Base Coast Festival. My faux fur wearing vegan friends and I in our hammocks taking too many drugs and dancing in our tie-dyed underwear. Maybe you know about that world. I've never seen a book about it. You could write about your tie-dyed underwear, drug-doing kids in their faux fur vegan wear. You write about the worlds you know that other people might not know. What situations, what geographies, what mistakes, what troubles or challenges have not been written about yet. Where are the silences in the culture or worlds or people that you know? Where are the silences on your street, in your yard, in your home, in your person? I promise you that that question is always fruitful. That question delivers. If you're looking for something to write about, you could sit down and ask that question every day, and it'll bring you something fruitful. If you are a straight white man, let's say, and you want to find a cultural black hole, you could write about being a man and your relationship to tenderness. Men haven't written about that very much. Write about the billion times vulnerability was shamed out of you. Write about what men say in the locker room or men's washrooms. Write critically about it. Giving voice to that which we do not speak, or have not spoken, or speak in whispers, can be a dangerous commitment. When people say the common adage, write about what frightens you, write what makes you uncomfortable, that's some of the same advice as writing from silence. What has gone unspoken or not shared? What are you afraid to say, but know to be true? Those acts of vulnerability, or being generous with your hidden self, of putting a true language to what others are afraid to articulate and share, those events and details and vocabulary in the writing world are gold. I spoke with my best friend, Colin Thomas. He's Vancouver's great theater critic. He's the wisest man I know, about my ideas for this talk. And he said, yes, and this is a quote, yes, everybody is fucked up. Everybody else is a mess too. But we all think that everyone else is coherent, and we're the only ones going around in a mess. If you address things that are behind the facade, he says, people are grateful for it because it's a relief. Wisest man I know. So the most obvious question is, what can't you write about? What have you seen or lived that you're not permitted to write or share? What or whom is preventing you from sharing that? And what are you hiding behind a mask because of politeness? Sometimes you're just not ready. Sometimes, as we'll see, it's not your story to tell. Sometimes other people need to die first, like my father. I couldn't have written my memoir while he was alive. But sometimes we silence ourselves from a false sense of propriety because we don't want to step outside a shared comfort. We're afraid to lose our privileges because to disrupt power, to disrupt silence, makes us vulnerable. Writing from silence comes with risk. I think in the long run, it's earned me friends and fans, but I know that it's also made people uncomfortable. Judy Bloom has made a lot of people uncomfortable. 4 of her books appeared on the American Library Association list of the top 100 banned and challenged books from 2009 and 2000 to 2009. They look at a decade. That's more appearances than any other author. Judy Bloom. Those books, if you're curious, are Tiger Eyes, Are You There, God, It's Me, Margaret, which was my favorite, Blubber, and Forever. But not Then Again, Maybe I Won't, not my nocturnal emitting friend Tony. The 2010-2019 list of banned books in the US include my friend Mariko Tamaki, but she's in good company because she's there with Toni Morrison, Maya Angelou, Sherman Alexie, Khaled Hosseini, Barbara Ehrenreich, the great academic thinker, Harper Lee, Aldous Huxley, Alison Bechdel, Orson Scott Card, sci-fi, are you kidding me? Atwood, Salinger, and even Anne Frank. So writing from silence, these are people who have spoke to silences that made people uncomfortable, and they are the hallmark of great writing. I want to give you some examples from my own writing of these ideas so that it's not just abstract. I'm going to put my money where my mouth is. I'm going to read less than a page from my novel. Look, it's product placement from my novel, Cumberland. It's adult content in case you've got kids around. This is your time to put your headphones in, if you, or maybe you could have 20 minutes ago. And because we're talking about discomfort, I want to invite you to notice if you feel awkward or weird or where you might be surprised. Cumberland is about 4 unrelated characters in a small town, and they sort of find each other. And one of those characters is a 15-year-old girl, Amanda. She hangs out with her hyper boyfriend, Alfie. She's kind of ambivalent about Alfie. And this is a small bit from her first scene in the book. It's the first time we see Amanda. Alfie is supposed to be driving her home, but he's going in the opposite direction. Amanda is tired, and Alfie isn't. Alfie eased the car over into the gravel and turned at a driveway that only led into an empty field. "What are you doing?" "Turning around," he said, without making a move to put the car in reverse. He looked at her for a while. Amanda thought his face seemed empty, as if he were still stoned, which he couldn't have been by now, or he were dead stupid. She tried not to smile at the thought in case he got the wrong idea. She was angry. "Well," she said, trying to sound frustrated. Though she hadn't noticed he'd pulled down his fly, he began fishing in his pants. "Oh, Alfie," she said, "come off it." He grinned at her with his dick in his hand and swollen. The car was still running, and their lights grazed across the dried grass of the field. Her voice was quiet and soft. "Give it up. I want to go home." Something inside her felt funny. He could be greedy, and she didn't mind that so much if he was pressing down on her or grabbing too hard or just grabbing when he shouldn't have been. She didn't mind as much because at least it was about her and what he wanted. Sometimes the greediness made her feel important. But every now and again, he'd do this and pull it out like it were something she hadn't seen. Or in the middle of sex, he'd just stop and beat off over top of her until he came, which could be a while, and he thought nothing of it. How could she complain? What do you say to a guy that does that other than don't at the time? And it never seemed right. He wasn't hurting her. "I turned the car off if I were you. Someone might pull over to see what's wrong." He was watching himself now and didn't look up. "If I leave it running, I can just back out." His breathing was ragged. He held his balls in one hand and fisted his dick in the other. Occasionally, he smacked it against the steering wheel. Amanda thought that was stupid. He looked small and ridiculous. She wanted to get out of the car and walk into the field to leave him to his business, but was afraid he'd drive off without her. Maybe she was supposed to touch herself or watch. She had no idea. Having a good time? She asked dryly. She gave an exaggerated yawn. He didn't answer. Amanda could only guess that he didn't realize what he was doing as he watched his right hand beat himself off, while the left had a glassy bit of pre-cum on its thumb that he brought to his lips and smacked off. Frig, she said. Get it over with. That's an embarrassing scene, right? I'm a little embarrassed reading from it. Maybe you're a little uncomfortable too, even in your own home. We can feel a kind of terror in our bodies when words take the shape of our secrets. And because it's a weird moment, I want to unpack this scene a little bit. I want to tell you that I was interested in the sexuality of these young people. I wrote this book partly because the erotic lives of teenagers is fascinating, because it's fraught. Mine was certainly fraught. The lives of my friends were too. But teen life is so often in TV and films and books sort of glamorized, cleaned up, romanticized, made rich. Teens are so often upper middle class. Where are all the kids who eat canned soup and grilled cheese with Kraft slices for lunch? And that cleaned up version of teenage life is also a kind of silencing, isn't it? A big part of how teenagers experience their lives is through their growing interest in sexuality. Sexuality teaches them a lot about how the world works. Sex and teens is so taboo that we mostly learn by doing. Oh, we have dress codes and manners and how you cross your legs and don't put your hands in your pockets and jokes about crusty socks in a boy's bedroom, and on and on. There are far more rules we learn to contain sexuality than there is discussion describing what it is. We are taught to control our sexuality because we are never explained what that sexuality is. Sexuality, then, teaches us a lot about silence. By looking at silence, we can better see what we're permitted to know openly and what we must only know in secret. As a gay man, I certainly knew that growing up. My body can do this. What is my body doing? But how do we learn if it's a secret? When I was a 10-year-old boy, an older boy brought me into his grandparents' basement and taught me some things two bodies could do undressed. We never once spoke about it outside of that basement. I never told anyone about it until I was an adult. I remember waking my mother up at 2 a.m, sobbing and shaking when I was 18 or 19, because the exchange had enough duress in it to profoundly shame me. I can feel that memory in my body. So we could also examine this aspect of silence, how silence can create a screen behind which we can do things, how silence gives permission to other people to do things to us. In Cumberland, I wanted to write about the teens I knew growing up who were screwed up and terrible and were often in situations that made you sick and uncomfortable. I wanted to write a book that saw them and didn't look away, that wasn't polite. A lot of the moments in this scene from my novel are ones I heard about from friends or witnessed myself in my teen years that nobody tells you about when you're a teenager. For starters, people you know are terrible. Weird shit happens. A lot of weird shit happens when you're a teenager. I think maybe less weird shit would happen, or shit would be less weird if we knew more of what was possible before it happens to us. You can see in there some of the Judy Bloom, right? She wrote about nocturnal emissions. I wrote about pre-cum. Maybe here is a good time to just pull the lens back a little bit to ask, when was the last time you read the word pre-cum, or spoke it, or had someone speak it to you? We could spend quite some time here polling ourselves for where that word first materialized in our own vocabularies. I bet I heard it for the first time through porn. Porn being not a very accurate or reliable depiction of the world. If you want your kids to keep learning everything they know about sex from porn, keep banning Judy Bloom books. Someone who read Cumberland came up to me after an event and told me, not in a supportive way, that I sure mentioned pre-cum a lot in my novel. I searched the manuscript, Pre-cum appears 3 times in over 90,000 words. I felt guilty and dirty for a while after that, which is probably what the stranger was hoping. And then I thought, well, why isn't it in other novels? Why aren't there poems about pre-cum? Why can't I write about it? And then, thinking that moment through some more, I got angry. I was arguing with that person in my head. Who benefits from the silence you're trying to impose on me in my book? Who benefits from hiding pre-cum? It sounds ridiculous as a question, I know, but a more complicated version of that question follows the logic. Is deleting Alfie, or just the fluids of his body, not a step towards denying the discomfort Amanda feels? Would omitting the details from this scene with Amanda and Alfie not be denying her experience, even a fictional experience? To extrapolate not so very far, would that erasure of her experience, erasing what is possible, what happens all the time, does that not enable rape culture? When I say that writing from silence is speaking truth to power, here it is. When we censor a novel, when we silence a truth that materializes in story, we can't help but privilege the position of some characters over another. We say, these lives are more valuable. I omit the detail of Alfie's bullying because the reader's discomfort is more important than the accurate representation of that teen girl, Amanda. The appearance of social order is more important than this secret of the failing of social order. Writing from silence is about encouraging a greater capacity for candor or honesty so we are less vulnerable to abuse. Writing from silence, I'm arguing, is about creating a greater capacity for citizenry, not propriety or civility, for the very definition of social, the welfare of human beings as members of society. It's about how we look after each other. Even if we put aside the idea of a social good, it's too heavy. Who cares about all of that stuff? I just want to be selfish. I want to writing from silence can simply be another way of saying, you want to write what's new. In creative writing, we're always chasing the fresh story or the new perspective. How do I write a love story when so many love stories have come before me? Writing from silence is the way to find it. I started my first novel, Cumberland. I told you that. I started my first novel, Cumberland. Oh, and I'm wearing my hat that I got from Ivy Coyote, which is MV, Michael V, MV, Queen of Cumberland. Thank you, Ivan E. Coyote. I started that book in my MFA doing my grad degree. The central character in Cumberland, Ernest, he works in a machine shop or a mill. And the prof who taught my course, he'll remain nameless, read the first chapter about Ernest and told me to write about something else. Nobody would be interested in this story, he said. People aren't interested in reading about work. That's a quote. I remember it. People aren't interested in reading about work, or mill work, I guess. In that first chapter, I wrote about how Ernest saw his brother burned alive in a fire at work. Someone was welding, and a spark flew and lit up a bucket of oil, which that guy tossed quickly out the open door, just as Ernest's brother was walking into the building. It's a true story that a friend's father told me. His brother went up in flames, he said, with a whoosh. My prof told me, don't write about work. Work is boring. Those lives are boring. So I'm also aware that not everyone is your best reader. You might be familiar with the sayings, you can't please everybody, you have to first please yourself, tell the story you want to hear. Those are common adages in the writing world. I like to frame it another way, which is that part of the job of writing from silence, part of the job of writing is to displease, to upset, to disrupt, to change. Because writing from silence is also giving voice to the places in which people are ignorant. It may be where I too am ignorant. The writer is ignorant. That's why I write. I write to know more, to know better, to know deeper. I write to research. What do I need to know to write accurately about working in mills or boys who don't drive girls home? Now, 20 some years later, I'm a creative writing prof in a university, so I'm aware how institutions silence language, silence diction, allow these words and not others. I can't comfortably speak at work the way my family speaks at home. The language I grew up in is a language of the street, a language of the machine shop, the garage, the backyard, the fishing boat, the pool hall, and bowling alley. I might look sophisticated, but I come from all those places. That's where my people hung out. People say things in my family that don't often materialize in books or in movies or in universities. The everyday language of my life is not the language of institutions. I notice that when I'm teaching and a fuck pops out, or I say, "This writing is the shit," which is a good thing. Some stories you simply can't tell if you're using the language of the institution, or if you're writing for the institution, any institution. If I was writing simply to be published, say, or to win prizes, I'd be making my books very differently. When I was preparing for this talk, I wondered long and hard what the RCA might think of this language. Is pre-com welcome here? Art institutions have their own silences. What gets called art or literature, for example, and what isn't? What's the difference between crafting and art? Are literature and art then not perhaps, sometimes, an ethics of silence? What is celebrated is another way of saying what is permitted. Maybe you've heard this in the news, but there's a big debate happening at Ottawa U right now because a white French prof spoke a version of the N-word in French, which was in the title of a piece of literature the class was studying. Speaking in French, mind you, which has its own relationship to that word, which is not precisely the same as the English history mostly we know via the US. In different languages, the words aren't easily translated. But many students spoke up denouncing the prof for speaking a French version of that word. It's become a huge debate. It's in the media. It's really in the media out east about white supremacy, colonial violence, French versus English, academic freedom, the free exchange of ideas, accuracy and the historical record, community harm. It's super complex. So in choosing which silences you give voice to, it's important to consider history, to consider the context in which that silence sits. Who usually gets to tell this story? Are you adding perspective or balance? Are you giving voice to other ideas or ways of knowing? Are you reinforcing power that controls or co-ops? Or are you trying to undo and resist that power with a new perspective, with new or rarely seen information? Who does that word harm and how? Who does that story harm and how? Who determines what is healing and what is harmful? Who gets priority in who heals best, or first, or last? So writing from silence isn't a carte blanche to say anything you care to. It's also important to think about what position you're speaking from, where are you in relationship to this word or story or silence? Are you speaking from a particular position with power or privilege or without it? Are you speaking for another on their behalf? And if so, what kind of relationship do you have to the people you're speaking for? Would they give you permission? And if not, should you be the one to write this? Are you working within the communities you're writing about, or are you writing without them? Obviously, not all silences are ours to tell. 3 decades into my art making, I'm more and more clear that one of the hardest things about writing is listening. You can't hear silence, obviously, without listening. You have to pay attention and ask questions and explore and muddle around. I could ask you, did you feel discomfort here tonight? Is there information for you in that discomfort? If you listen inside, if you lean in to where you're uncomfortable, what do you find there? Okay, I just have one last story for you. This is one of the biggest smacks upside my author head. When I was working on the end of my second novel, I brought them with me. I don't know why, but my second novel, Progress. So I'm going to give you a tiny little précis of the beginning and the end. At the start of the book, Helen is visiting the grave site of her boyfriend who died when they were teenagers, 16 years ago. And she often has lunch there and brings binoculars because she watches a power dam that's being built. In the first page of the novel, she sees a man fall to his death on the construction site. The construction company doesn't have time to retrieve the body. They're working at a deadline because the Queen is coming. So they just pour concrete over him. She sees this guy be buried alive, or be buried, sorry, he's dead. She sees this guy be buried within the dam. This apparently happens in dam construction all the time. But do we ever hear about it? That same day, Helen's estranged brother, Robert, returns home after 16 years absent. He left just before the boyfriend died, her boyfriend. He was a teen runaway, and he discovers on his return that his parents died years ago. He hasn't been in touch with anybody. So there's a lot of other business in here, but at the end of the novel, Helen and Robert reconcile in this wild gesture. Because of that power dam, the town is being moved. That means they have to move the cemetery. It's being relocated. And Robbie, who missed his mother's funeral, convinces his sister to dig up his mother's casket on their own as a middle finger to the institutions. They rebury her where they want, on land that will remain after the flood. It's the same gravesite where the boyfriend was buried, where Helen saw the man die in the dam accident. I was struggling with the ending when I was writing that. I couldn't quite get it to land. It just wasn't working right. I couldn't get the parts to fit. And Colin, who I call when I have a problem, he gave me a bunch of feedback about symmetry between the start and the end of the novel. I couldn't figure out what he was talking about, even after a few conversations. We talked about it over multiple days. And then in the third conversation, I realized the symmetry he was talking about was in the burials that started and ended the book. 2 burials because of the power dam. I hadn't seen that there were 2 bookended burials. I hadn't held both those ideas in my head at the same time, even though I spent years writing this book, even though we were talking about the ending and the beginning in the conversations. That's an example maybe of how dumb I am, but let's assume I'm not a complete idiot. Part of listening is noticing what is and not what you intend. I always tell my students that we write 2 stories. What we are planning to write, the idea in our heads, playing it out over time as we put words down on paper, trying to capture it or invent it, trying to hear and record the things. And the second story is the thing that we have written, what is actually on the paper or the computer screen. What's made it into that piece that we didn't intend? What other images, ideas, patterns have materialized from our subconscious as we're trying to populate this world, which are not part of an intentional pattern, but make a pattern nonetheless? Anyone who's written long form will know this. When the draft is done, you have to mostly forget what you wanted it to be and see what it is. And that's a kind of listening to the story for what you haven't seen before. Colin says, or I'm quoting him again, that with writing, you have to get out of your own way, allowing yourself to become a conduit. He's saying we have to not always be conscious of what we're doing. You have to follow your creative gut. Stepping to the side of your own perceived coherence, that you are in control of all of these things. Stepping aside to allow the silent voice to speak. You allow the intuitive self that's been repressed to have expression. Said another way, you dream stuff up. So he's asking us to get out of our rational, deliberate way. We know this with humor. All the best jokes come unplanned, right? They spring alive in the moment, alive at the dinner party. If you plan the joke, it's not as good as the one that comes fresh over food. You can't pre-plan those things. And some come out before you or the room are even ready for them. Humor, I argue, is another form of listening. It's another form of being the conduit, because you're picking up on a nuance in the moment, a truth we're shocked to see or hear, and humor comes from that. The irony is, when you listen to the incoherence, you find order. There's a whole other system of order which isn't deliberate at all. Critics and academics are always talking about this or that system in a book as being deliberate, but we know that much of what is best in our writing or art appears as a surprise to us randomly. Teachers have fooled us into believing everything in art is by conscious design. You might consciously keep it, but you don't consciously put it there. And Colin adds, what it comes down to is trusting something outside yourself, because that's how the unconscious magic happens. You might say that what came into the work from the subconscious, what materialized without you intending it to, those qualities are also a kind of silence, the silence of the unconscious. Always our biggest insights come from the silences which are our own. Writing from silence then necessitates listening, not just for what you do know and hasn't been articulated, but for what you haven't known until now, and now, surprisingly, you hear. That's my talk, writing from silence.
Well, thank you, Michael. That was certainly thought-provoking. I'm sure there are a lot of questions out there. I was really struck by your quote, "Not all silences are ours to tell." And I was wondering if you could maybe elaborate on that notion. So how do I, or collectively, I guess, we know what silences are ours to tell? And do you feel like you have to have firsthand experience about something to sort of write its truth?
Well, I'll take the second half of your question first, and then I maybe move into the first half. I don't think you have to have firsthand experience, because art is about finding the new, and art is about building bridges between yourself and another. And I think that if one of the great gifts of the imagination is that we can imagine what it's like to be other people. Even if I want to tell the story of what my life was like with that, as a 10-year-old with that kid, the bully in his grandparents' basement, I'm not that 10-year-old anymore. So I'm in lots of ways, even if I want to write about my own experience that isn't alive in this moment, I'm still imagining a self that is not the self I am now, today. I have to invent and dream myself back into a previous version of who I was. That's the same process when we imagine ourselves into other people. Like, I'm not a 15-year-old girl, but I feel like I know Amanda really well. I grew up with girls like Amanda. I'm living through that experience of, I'm living in the writing. I'm living through, as I'm writing, I'm living the moments that I saw and witnessed, and I'm imagining myself into them. So I think that's where compassion comes from. You can picture yourself in the shoes of somebody else. The problem comes when you haven't done your research. You haven't lived that experience. You haven't been in proximity to that experience. You're not writing about people that you know very well, and you haven't done sufficient research to understand them well. And that's where a lot of my students run into problems in first year and second year, because they write about things that they don't know anything about. I'll ask for a suggestion, and they'll pick a city that they've never been in. Let's pick a city we're going to set this story, and they'll say Boston. I'm like, who's been to Boston? No one's been to Boston. Like, how the hell can you write about Boston if you've never been there? You can't. You don't know anything about it. So, but you can research what Boston's like. You don't have to necessarily go to Boston to find out things about Boston. You write other books written by people who've lived in Boston. You watch movies about Boston. You read articles, newspapers about Boston. You read the local paper. You read the gossip rags. There are ways that you can do research to find that stuff out. And the other big question, I think, with regards to writing about, what silences are we allowed to speak to, it's also a matter of who holds the power culturally. And the more privilege and power that you have, if you are a straight white guy, a lot of doors have been open to you. So maybe you don't tell the story of people who haven't had nearly as many doors. Maybe those doors that haven't been open to a Black trans woman in a small town who's poor, and you're a rich white dude who lived in a big city and whose dad owned a big company, maybe they need to open those doors, and those aren't yours to open. So your relationship to cultural power and cultural capital determines in many ways the more privilege you have, the more space you should be leaving for other people. I think that's how I move through this question of what lives am I allowed to write about. And if you want to write about people who aren't in your circle, who are not part of your group, then you ask permission. You meet with people from those communities. You let them know that you want to write about this. You ask them questions about it. You do research within those communities. We see this with the First Nations communities across, Indigenous people across the country. I've been saying to academics for years, stop writing about us, write with us, write in community with us. Don't write about us as objects. We're people, we're subjects. We hear that message really consistently. And that's about who has cultural capital and whose stories get listened to, and what are the perspectives on those. I think all of that stuff, you have to take those things into account when you decide. You can write anything you want, but when you decide that you want to publish it, it becomes a cultural object, and you need to think about your place in that culture and the place of the people you're writing about in that culture. And you need to be empowering people to own more of their stories, which means you don't steal it from them. That's like 10 different answers.
No, that's great. On cultural silences, and we were talking about culture, can you unpack for us how these ideas about cultural silences might apply to other art forms?
Yeah, well, I think I'm the very narrative writer, so and there are lots of other kinds of art in the world that isn't narrative. But thinking about if you're a sculptor, you think about what materials are available to you, who produces the materials that you use, where does the power in the things that you produce come from? Does it come from the originality that you have in the thing that you've created? Or is it innate to the object itself? Have you found new information in that? Or are you borrowing and from other people? And which people are you borrowing from? Like we see this, that sounds really abstract, but we see this with music all the time. There's a lot of talk in music circles about what sound you take. I remember when Beck came out, he's a white guy, and he sampled all different kinds of music and got into trouble for stealing music from artists who didn't have the same sort of cultural capital as him, didn't have the same kind of advantages that he did. And we saw that with Ice-T. When Ice-T started rapping, he was the big Canadian, right? White rap artist. And he was getting all this press, but he wasn't from the community that was heavily into rap. So the idea of where you source Vanilla Ice, sorry, Andrea Rutley's telling me not Ice-T, Vanilla Ice. Vanilla Ice. Oh, see, look, that's where you think up things on the spot. But you got smarter people than you to save you. Vanilla Ice. And he got in all kinds of hot water for that. So thinking about where your materials come from, what kind of art practice you're engaged in, what your relationship to that practice is. You don't just steal basket making techniques from the internet. You get taught how to make baskets from the people who've been making baskets forever, and that practice then becomes a gift that you've been given. It's this whole idea of there's this really exciting conversation about the gift economy and art as being part of the gift economy. And when you turn art into a consumerist object, something that's sold rather than given, you cheapen it and it doesn't become art anymore. And part of that conversation is about who is allowed to give the gifts of their teaching and who is allowed to borrow from it. And I think that positionality is really interesting. I think it's really fascinating to think, where have I learned my making from? What am I borrowing from? Am I referencing those places? Am I giving power back to those people? Am I saying this song, I was heavily influenced by these artists. You should be listening to them. Are you covering their work to draw attention to them? I think that kind of stuff is all super interesting. It's really fascinating.
Hey, Cookie. Michael, this is Elliot Hinkle in Portland, and your talk is blowing my mind because the work that I do is with lived experience with young people. And it's never about writing, usually. It's about them speaking about it to advocate to change systems. And I had not considered it in this way. And so I'm trying to think of, I guess, what my question is, but some of them have written about it in poetry or done videos or different things to try and get adults to understand it. But I guess I hadn't considered um, how much what they're doing is this writing from silence. They're talking continuously about things that people do not want to talk about. So that could be suicide, that could be abuse, all of these things. Um, and it's so interesting to me to think about how do I talk to young people about what you're saying, which is what we're doing is talking about the things that people either don't want to talk about or don't want to hear. And we're doing it in ways that I think are respectful and sometimes maybe aren't, but for a good reason. So I guess I'm thinking about how this extends, of course, beyond writing, how it's really powerful and how I've watched it change policies and systems and lives. So I'm not even sure that I have a question, I guess, unless you have thoughts about that. But I just really appreciate this. And I also really resonated with how often my experience has been sitting in a situation and thinking, I have so many questions about this and no one's talking about it. So whether that's entering the gay world and having no idea what the language is or whatever that may be as a teen. So I just really appreciate this. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Elliot. I have some thoughts. Like, I noticed when I went to therapy that there were stories I was invited to tell that I didn't feel like I had permission to tell anywhere else. And there were things I talked about in therapy that were brand new. And I think a lot of what happens in therapy is that we do get these opportunities to discuss the taboo. And the yeah, so it's, I think culturally, writing from silence manifests in lots of different ways. That it's there, and we know that telling our story is about empowerment, and that being able to articulate your experience makes room for yourself. That's why the big slogan in the 90s with the gay community when HIV was so big, the big slogan was silence equals death. People are dying because we're not talking about this, right? So we see how it manifests in lots of different ways in the world. And I think, so in some ways, kind of the subtext of the argument that I'm making is that we need to be uncomfortable. We need to notice the places in which we want to shut people up or shut ourselves up, or where we feel shut down, and question those things to see, well, why is there a taboo around this? Who's benefiting from that? Part of the question that I'm asking is, um, who how does power maintain itself by preventing us from speaking our truth? And how do these social systems like propriety, like the way that we police our language, that I can't talk shit and whatever when I'm at work. I need to be careful about the way that I frame things to be heard well. I need to be careful of the way I frame things in order to gain the respect of the people who I work with. It's not everybody, right? Lots of people. I'm also drawing like black and white scenarios because I do talk like myself often. But there are meetings where I just know that I need to be careful about how I approach stuff. But all of that, in lots of ways, is about maintaining power. It's about maintaining this idea of a veneer of what we're supposed to look like, the polite company. And that stuff makes people feel like they don't belong. And one of the things that I really had to teach myself was to recognize that everywhere I am in the world, I belong. Like I'm allowed to exist, and I have a right to be in the places where I am. I might not always be welcome, but I certainly belong everywhere that I am, even if I'm not always welcome or if I'm taking up space or whatever, right? There are certainly, like, I wouldn't want to walk into a woman's bathroom when I'm when I don't identify as a woman, for example. But I certainly belong. It's this weird duality, because I certainly belong where I am. I'm just not welcome there. And so maybe it's important to recognize that, especially as a gay man, and when you've been marginalized in the world, that you're taught increasingly that you're not welcome in these spaces. I wasn't welcome in the men's washrooms. I wasn't welcome in the boys' change room. That was certainly made really clear to me. And being able to articulate those things, being able to talk about them and work through them, well, you get closer and closer to the truth of how power works and how culture works and how we're made to feel less than or more than in those dynamics. So writing from silence and speaking our truth is a way of making people recognize that our lives are legitimate, that we belong, that these experiences are legitimate experiences. What are we communicating to our young kids if we don't allow them to talk about their bodies, right? There's such a taboo around children and the things their bodies can do. What are we teaching them about the love they might have for themselves if we're instilling in them a shame for the things their bodies can do? And what are we teaching them about how you self-actualize in the world as a sexual creature, if we're not allowing them to discuss those sorts of things? I find all of that stuff really exciting, really fraught.
Yeah, I have a question.
Hi, Douglas.
Hi. Thank you so much. Great talk. So I wonder if you have advice about writing about things that feel like too charged, even for yourself. There have been like times where people have said to me, "Oh, you should definitely write about that," and I think, why would I ever want to write about it? I would never like put myself back there. And yet sometimes I think, oh, I wish I could, put that in a different light, or even come at it from a different angle, even metaphorically. So I just wonder if you have advice about approaching topics sideways so that they're more digestible for you.
Yeah, well, I think you just answered your question. Because I think you do first, you don't have to write about everything, right? Just because you see a silence doesn't mean you need to write about it. And if you're going to re-traumatize yourself, then maybe you don't, right? If it's not going to feed you and it's not going to help you, then there's no reason to do it. And if you want to take on the challenge of writing about stuff that you think is too highly charged for you to write about as confession, then you write about you bury it in fiction. Like, the Cumberland has a young boy who has the exact same sexual experience with a bully that I had. I wrote it's practically nonfiction. I invented a bunch of things, details around it, and I changed names and that sort of thing. But I put it in a fictional container so that if anyone came to me and said, "Oh, that experience was, super intense," I can say, "Well, it's fiction." And fiction is a really great way of you writing about your life and not having to answer for it, because you just call it fiction and nobody knows the difference. On the flip side, like my dad's name is Ernest, and he works in a mill in the same town and lives on the same street and in the same apartment and has the same friends. And so I borrowed a lot of things from my dad's life to make that character feel more real. And I had to explain to my dad, if you read this book, it's going to look a lot like you on the surface, but I know you don't go have sex with men in the parks at night, or I don't think you do. So so it isn't actually you. I just borrowed things from my real life to make the character feel more real for me. So you can also get in a hot water where you borrow things from your life to flesh out the character, and then people will say, "Well, that is me. Why did you write about me?" And even if it's fiction, you might still get accused of that. And I think the only, you just have to I had to teach people in my life the difference between truth and the two kinds of truth. The truth, which is a lived experience, and the truth, which is a fictional truth. And that fictional truth might have a lot of resemblance to the real world, but you've crafted it, you've chosen it, you've picked things deliberately to tell a greater truth than the actual events that happened. And I think if you want to write it, the closer something is and the more fraud it is and the more intense it is, the more you translate that into something that's further and further from your experience. So you don't write about a gay man named Michael who lives in Kelowna and has a husband named Francis. You write about a 60-year-old woman who has no legs and lives in a wheelchair and has a daughter and a puppy named Poodles, or whatever. And you give her the experience so that you can see it outside yourself as something that you're using to understand more carefully. A lot of ways in which I write is I'm writing to find out more about an experience that I have. And translating it into somebody else's life gives me enough distance that I'm looking at it through a new lens and a new perspective. So I can also invent things within that perspective that might be helpful for me. People come in and help that person in a way that I didn't have the help that I needed. Or somebody has an insight into their own experience that I didn't have at the time, but I gain over time. And the more distant you make the thing, I think the easier it is for you to see it as an object outside yourself, so that you don't feel as exposed and you have greater insight through distance. But you don't have to write it. Nobody's telling you you have to do it. So if somebody tells you, well, maybe people are telling you, but you don't have to listen to them. There are lots of things I'm not going to write about until more people in my family die, for example, Sorry, Mom. Colleen, your mic's not on, hun. Colleen, your microphone. I can't hear you. You're on mute. There you go.
I'm not controlling my mute. That's why it's being done in another room.
Oh, I see.
I apologize for that. Yeah, Zoom moderator 101. Wow, this is just a really powerful topic, and I'm sure everyone here has more questions and we could speak for another hour. Just one quick wrap-up question that you just sort of alluded to. Are there any stories or silences that you haven't felt you could source in your own writing?
Yeah, for sure. Like, I don't write about my mom in my memoir very much at all because my mom's still alive and I love her dearly. And I just didn't want to write things that I thought, even writing about things where she's not in the story, I still feel like, oh geez, if she ever read that memoir, she'd be really freaked out at some of the fires I went through. And I heard family stories when I was researching. I talked to my uncles and I heard family stories, and I had some stuff that I wrote in the book, and I was like, you know what? I am not going to include that information in there because it's just not my story to tell, and it would do more harm than good. It might do lots of good for lots of people, but it'll do harm to the people that I care about. So there've been, and I don't write much about my husband. Like he's way more private than I am. I've made all kinds of art about my body and myself and talked about my sexuality, and I have not discussed my sexuality about my husband because he'd be not very pleased. So it's that idea of you have to be mindful of who your community is and speaking to them to make sure that you've got, even though it's my sex life, it's also his sex life. And I value that relationship and I respect him. And out of that respect and value, I make sure that I keep my distance from those topics. And I think that's fair. There are a million things to write about. There are lots of other things. I've been having sex for a long time. If I really want to write about sex, I can pick the first 20 years of my life. I don't have to pick the last 7.
Okay, very good. I guess on that note, we're 5 minutes after the hour. So in respect for your time and everyone else's, Thank you so much for sharing your insights on silences in writing and giving a voice to both and encouraging a greater candor. So I thank everyone here for joining us this evening for this really intriguing topic. So thank you very much to everyone. And just before we leave, I just wanted to mention our upcoming Art Talks in November. If you're interested in joining us again on November the 10th, we will be speaking to Kenny, the blues boss, who will discuss 50 years of blues music. And then on November the 24th, join us for author, poet, and performer Aaron Scott, who will be talking about the topic Creating Through Grief, which is very, very intriguing. Thanks again very much to everyone for joining us, and we hope to see you all again soon. Have a good evening. Take care.
Thanks, Colleen. Thanks, everybody.
Take care. Thank you.